when I started, we've actually gotten questions from folks who want to grow pepper, right? And black pepper, totally different crop, but all the capsicum and our regular pepper species absolutely open for great garden development. So today we're going to talk a little bit about peppers and people. I think some of the cool things about the crops that we grow are how they came to us, and a little bit about their use in human society. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Some of those, questions about the Aztecs and things, we'll get to that. Then we're going to talk some about pepper species and cultivars. So over the last few years, I've been doing quite a few pepper trials. So we'll talk some about what some of the good performers are, what are some of the trials that we're doing in the upcoming year for disease resistance and those types of activities. And then we're going to talk about growing peppers, right? Buying, planting, managing, and we'll end our discussion with some of the issues that we see that crop up in our pepper production, whether they be bacterial or fungal issues, or whether they be physiological, and some of those blossom end rot types of issues that we see in our peppers. So that's a little bit of the outline of what we're going to talk about today. And as we begin, we're kind of going to talk about how it is that peppers came into cultivation and how long they've been around. So for those of us who think about some of the main crops that impact human civilization, peppers probably aren't real high on our list, but they've actually been in cultivation for thousands of years. And as a crop that's native to the Americas, right, to South America, Peru, Bolivia, that part of the country, they've actually had a huge impact on the culture, the native culture of the Americas. So people estimate that there have been folks growing peppers anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 years. So they've been domesticated and underused for a long time. As a native of the Americas, in much warmer climates, they're actually a perennial, right? We grow them as annuals, but in their native climates, there can actually be a large shrub that are grown for several years. And they have a huge amount of culture and lore and impact on the people that have long grown peppers in their culture. Everything from the Incas, who thought that peppers were the brother of their king. They've been used for tribute, right, for taxes, for currency, and honestly, to treat just about every possible ailment you can imagine in the history of mankind. Everything from colds to snake bites to rheumatism to hemorrhoids. They have been used for a whole host of activities. Some of the really interesting things when you think about how peppers have been used historically is that we tend to think of ourselves, right, as, scientists and culinary aficionados, but they have been classified by pungency and by culinary use for literally thousands of years. In fact, the Aztecs had specific peppers that they used with lots of specific dishes. For instance, green peppers were typically eaten with frogs, and yellow peppers were typically eaten with salamanders. So it's not just us that do food pairing. Our amphibian pepper combinations have been going on for literally hundreds and thousands of years. And when we eat peppers, there are kind of three main things that we experience with that flavor. And it has to do with the scent, right? The aromas, the volatile compounds, of course, the heat, which might be one of the first things that we would think of when we talk about pepper, that capsaicin, but also the sugars are really important. And so we're just going to talk a little bit about how, as humans, we experience the diverse and amazing flavor and taste of peppers. So the first thing that comes to our senses is often the scent, right? And this is probably, not 2-methoxyl-3-isobutylpyrazine, right? We probably don't know that very well, but it's actually the green pepper scent, and it is one of the strongest volatile compounds on Earth. It's thought that humans can sense that at 2 parts per trillion. So, so the scent of peppers is really important in the way that we experience them. I can't speak for cows, but but it's pretty important for us as eaters. And those volatile compounds, there can be hundreds that are present, but it's probably, anywhere from 50 to 100 that are really important for us as far as the flavors. And some are fruity, and some are smoky, and some are sweet. So even the way that we experience the sweetness of peppers can actually also partially be related to a smell. Then, of course, there comes the heat, right? And it's thought that we could almost call the heat of peppers maybe even the sixth taste or sense, right? We've got bitter, sweet, sour, salty, umami, or savory. But the really interesting thing about the way that we experience pepper heat is that it's not on one of our taste buds, right? So we don't experience it in the same way that we would sweet or sour. It is actually the pain receptors in our mouth and in our tongue that allow us to experience the heat of peppers. So it's true, right? It really can be painful for those very strong capsaicinoid types of secondary products that we taste. And the interesting thing about it is that when those pain receptors are triggered, it releases endorphins, which we can actually get addicted to. So hot pepper addiction, who knew, right? The way that we test and talk about those heat units are in terms of Scovilles. And I'm sure that you've all heard of the Scoville unit, but the way that it's used is that it's continually diluted, right? So you've got this compound that's an pepper extract, and you see if people can sense it, right, and taste it, and then you continue to dilute that till you get to the point where they can't taste it anymore. And so all of those dilutions end up representing the Scoville units. And so there are, of course, more laboratory types of analytical methods that are used, but we still talk about the Scovilles a lot. And you might say, well, what in the world is this for? Why would plants produce these compounds? It's because that peppers, if they're eaten by mammals, through the digestive tract, the seeds can be inactivated, right? And that's a really poor dispersal technique. So these really pungent compounds are to keep mammals from eating the peppers. Birds can eat them. The bird digestive tract doesn't impact the seeds at all, and birds can't sense that capsaicin. So peppers would prefer to be dispersed by birds, and that's part of the reason why we have this heat. Of course, it's not just capsaicin. There's also a lot of sugar compounds. And as we know, when fruits ripen, a lot of times those sugar compounds increase. So there are higher levels of sugar in our red peppers, in our yellow peppers versus green peppers, which are simply just the immature, right? So white, purple, green, all of those different colors of peppers are really just immature. And as they mature, their pigments that are yellows and oranges and reds will increase along with the sugar content. And there are many different kinds of carotenoids that are the reds and the yellows and the oranges, and those all increase as pepper fruit ripen. So there are lots of great vitamins that are in peppers. When we say, provitamin A, right, we might think of carrots for vitamin A, but the truth of the matter is that just a little bit of red peppers can provide all of the daily recommended human needs for provitamin A. So they are really high content of provitamin A. And one pepper can actually have up to 6 oranges worth of vitamin C. So a really good source of vitamin C as well in our peppers. And of course, we see peppers in so many other places, right? From pepper spray, as a human defense tactic. Some zoos even feed pepper flakes to their flamingos so that they get that brilliant coloring. So peppers impacting our lives in so many different ways. So now that you've kind of gotten the geeky introduction to some of the ways that we experience peppers, I want to get down a little bit just to the huge range of types of peppers that we grow and cultivars of peppers. So as we're driving down, right, this pepper highway, there are lots and lots of different kinds of options that we have to grow, right? So there are ornamentals, bells, wax peppers, kind of when you think about our banana peppers, to the Italian roasting or the Marconi. ancho, poblano, jalapenos, cayennes, habaneros, and then the really crazy hot stuff. And so last week when we were talking about brassicas, we talked about, the different species and some of the ways that those have been available and grown in cultivation for several years. There are many different species of peppers. There's really one that we grow the most, and that's Capsicum annum. And so most of the peppers that we grow, from jalapenos to bell peppers to cayennes and a lot of the wax peppers, those really all fall in Capsicum annum. We tend to talk about them in terms of their shape, which we kind of use as a metric for heat or pungency. It's not necessarily always accurate, but that's where the most of our production peppers are. Another one that we do sometimes grow is chinensis, and that is the habanero pepper. Probably the third pepper species is frutescens here, and that's Tabasco. So we really only grow one Tabasco pepper, but it's a pretty important one if you're a Tabasco sauce aficionado. And then we have a few minor species that we're starting to see a little bit more. Bacatum, if you've seen the new All-American Selections winner Mad Hatter pepper, that is from that species. So very minor, but most of what we grow are in the Capsicum annum category. And so we'll just kind of start. We'll talk about ornamentals a little bit, and then we'll just go through some of these main types of peppers, talk about some of the main cultivars that might be good for our gardens, and some of the uses and how they're grown in the garden. So when we talk about the ornamental peppers, one of the key attributes is that the fruit are pointing up, right? So this is super chili in the background, and many of our ornamental peppers do have some heat, right? So this is chili pepper. It does have some pungency, but most people who are truly growing for culinary purposes would say that it doesn't quite have the flavor profile, the whole profile that what they want in their really good cooking peppers. So many times, while the ornamental might be described as hot or sweet, they might not be quite as good as what we would grow just for a culinary pepper, but they can be beautiful additions to our garden. So that's super chili. This is Medusa down here. So you see those fruit being very upright, and they can be great in containers, in mixed plantings, in our landscape beds. Medusa is actually a mild, so even, kind of kid safe in our plantings. Pretty and Sweet is another example of an ornamental edible that is non-pungent, right? So these are really cute sweet peppers in a variety of different colors as they ripen. Now, they're probably not going to be quite as flavorful, not that whole aroma compound that we would get out of some of our really good say Italian roasting peppers, but they can be a pretty cool addition to containers or raised beds, fun for kids or big kids. And to make this tour of the different types of peppers more interesting, I have arranged them in terms of the analogies that they have with different types of cars, right? So I like to describe our ornamental peppers as Volkswagens. They're really novel appearance. They're pretty cool, but they're not like a performance automobile, right? No race cars, no astonishing flavor profile, but in spots they can be a pretty cool addition. Now, when we really get down to bell peppers, those are absolutely, right, the sedans of the world. They are all over the highway. They're the most valuable commercial, economic pepper. When we talk about the breeding that's been done, a lot of our best disease resistance resides in bell peppers because they're some of the ones that are the most valuable commercially. So we have a lot of great options as far as shape, color, and disease resistance in our bell peppers. Now, as I kind of mentioned earlier, green peppers are simply immature peppers. And so when we let them mature, they will generally have the colors of orange, red, or yellow. Now, there are a couple different limitations to letting them mature on the plant, right? Because they take longer, they do have a slightly higher risk of getting insect or disease damage. So that's the reason why colored peppers are so expensive when we buy them in the store, because they've produced longer on the plant. The other issue is that because they're on the plant longer, peppers will not set more new fruit while they're still maturing older fruit. So letting a pepper mature and completely get ripe on our plant can actually reduce the yield of the plant, because while it's on there taking up sugars and photosynthates, the plant won't set as many more. So while colored peppers are great, we will probably get a slightly higher yield if we pick them all as green, right? So the Accords and the Camrys of the Toyota world. We tend to think of bells as all non-pungent, which is not completely true. Most of our bell peppers are sweet. It's just one gene difference that makes bell peppers not produce any of the capsaicinoids. But there are a few bell peppers that have a little bit of heat, less than 1,000 Scoville units generally, but Mexibel and Cajun bell are examples of a couple of bell peppers that do have a little bit of heat in them. And one of the most common diseases that we see in peppers is bacterial leaf spot. And so we're getting an increasingly high number of peppers on the market that have bacterial leaf spot resistance. I've trialed several of these across the last few years. And so some of the ones that have produced well have been Alliance and Red Knight, which mature from green to red. Macate has been one that performed well, and it matures from green to yellow. One of the ones in the previous slide, that one in the middle of the picture that has the slightly elongated fruit, that's Big Bertha. It's done pretty well in our trials. Now, it doesn't have bacterial leaf spot resistance. One of the soil-borne diseases that peppers are certainly known to struggle with is Phytophthora. And so there are some of the newer commercial bell peppers that have Phytophthora resistance, and I'm growing some of these in trials this year. So, next year and the next few years, I'll be able to talk a little bit more about the performance of Phytophthora resistant peppers. When we think about the season, what it looks like out there right now, it seems like this might be a good year to try some Phytophthora resistance peppers. We definitely have plenty of soil moisture out there. So then, of course, we have the whole range of kind of mini peppers, lunchbox or snackers, right? The Cooper minis of the world that have great taste, but are also fun for younger audiences. This is Eros, which is a small baby bell. These mature a little bit faster, right, than our larger bells, and they can be a pretty cool way to introduce kids to peppers. Many of them are fairly compact plant size, so they can be good for containers. Sweetie Pie is a recent All-American Selections winner. It's a small red, medium-sized red pepper that has performed well in trials as well. Lipstick and Glow are kind of small tapered or lunchbox peppers. One of my favorite from last year's trials was this. It's the second one from the left of your screen, and that's Just Sweet. It was one of my favorites in the trial, and it was also from many other people, and it actually won the All-American Selections last year. It's a pretty large size plant with 1 to 1.5 ounce fruit. And so one of my challenges with these really small peppers is that they're really time consuming to pick. But this one was pretty fast to pick. I got about 50 fruit per plant. So it was very productive, and it also did well in our taste trials. Several folks who were at the Fall Gardeners Festival may have had a chance to taste Just Sweet. So that's one of my favorite newer peppers. Another one that I've liked pretty well over the last few years is Candy Cane, which has variegated leaves in addition to variegated fruit. So it starts off with a green and white striped candy cane, and then it matures from yellow to orange to red. And when it gets completely mature, it'll just be a solid red. When we talk about kind of our Italian roasting, our Marconi, our wax peppers, I tend to think of these as kind of the Crown Victorias of the pepper world. So there are some that are absolutely sweet classics, right? We have some of these beautiful Italian roasting peppers. Some people call them Marconi, and some of the key cultivars like Carmen is a newer cultivar, but it's been on the market for at least a half a dozen years. A nice red color, it's produced well. Mamma Mia Giallo is a larger Italian roasting pepper. Escamillo is also one. And so these tend to be really good for roasting and cooking. Sweet, a nice sugar content, but also a good flavor profile. One of my favorite kind of medium-sized of these sweet roasting peppers has been Cornito Giallo. It's on the next slide. I'll show you a picture of it. It's a little bit smaller, so it's matured a little bit quicker than Mamma Mia Giallo or some of the larger peppers. Wax peppers, to be completely accurate, are peppers that kind of start as a yellow in their immature stage and then mature to an orange or a red. And so we think of these traditionally as a sweet banana pepper. And sweet bananas sometimes have a little bit thinner wall than these Italian roasting peppers. I think that probably maybe not quite the aroma profile, but great for a lot of different kinds of dishes. Sweet Sunset has been one that's performed well in trial that does have bacterial leaf spot resistance. Then there's some great open pollinated cultivars like Cubanelle. Jaworski is an heirloom sweet roasting pepper that did pretty well in our taste trials last year. So this is Cornito Giallo. I like it because it's a smaller sweet pepper. I had about 50 fruit per plant last year, harvested just a little bit earlier because it's a smaller pepper. On your left of the screen right here is Mamma Mia Giallo, so big, beautiful Italian roasting pepper. Fruit almost as heavy as some of the bell peppers, so not quite as many fruit per plant, but a good producer later into the season, right? So think of these as late August into September. It takes a little while for these fully colored fruit to mature. That red pepper in the middle is Corno de Toro. Jaworski there is on the right, so you can see a lot of these different tapered shapes. Sweet Sunset was, in my 2017 trials, performed and yielded just about at the same level as the larger bell peppers. So it's prolific producer, a lot of fruit per plant, and does have bacterial leaf spot resistance. So if you're a sweet banana pepper eater, this is a great option, right? But wax peppers, do sometimes have a little bit of heat, right? So a little bit of sneaky speed there. In addition to our sweet bananas, we also have some hot banana peppers. Hot Sunset, bacterial leaf spot resistant cultivar released about the same time, not surprisingly, as Sweet Sunset, was a good producer for me. Hot Spot is another option that has bacterial leaf spot resistance. And then Mexican Sunset and Mexican Sunrise on the right hand of your screen there, that's Mexican Sunset. So some newer and productive hot wax cultivars that are recent All-American Selections winner. And so while they do have heat, we're not talking about Cayenne level heat. Most of them are less than about 1,000 Scoville units. Here's a picture of Hot Sunset. Set fruit prolifically. It was just packed with fruit. You can kind of see the fruit just hanging all over this plant. So, so it was a good producer in trials. We have a few peppers that I refer to as the Mazda Miatas, right? They look spicy, but they're not really that hot. And these are some of the ones that are in that different species that we're starting to get a few. These are more kind of our South American peppers. These are Capsicum boxum. There on the middle of your screen, you can see the Mad Hatter. It has a cool shape. Then Ayarico is the one there on the right hand of your screen. So the cool thing about these different species of peppers is that you kind of get a little bit different flavor profile. And so these are described often as being a little bit more citrusy, a little bit more floral. So it has to do with those different aroma compounds. In my trials, I will say, kind of as a subtle warning, don't expect, bell pepper yield out of these. They're really cool and interesting taste, interesting shape, fun to grow, but you're not going to get the great yield that you might out of some of our more bell peppers. They tend to be a little bit taller plant, so, not bred to be as compact as many of our garden peppers. So, we're getting a little bit hotter. The cars are getting a little bit faster, and we're moving into, these are Ancho or Poblano. These are mildly hot, and usually they're not eaten fresh, they're eaten roasted. And so you kind of get that earthy, mellow, smoky flavor. If you like chili rellenas, this is the role of the Poblano pepper. We don't grow a ton of them in the United States, but if you're a pepper culinary wizard, then you'll probably want some of these for your own cooking. Not a ton of Scoville, but just getting a little bit warmer. And there are some species that have cultivars that have bacterial leaf spot resistance. Jalapenos are some of my favorite to grow. They're, of course, a shorter but a blocky, really thick-walled pepper. And in my trials, they've gotten probably about 2/3 the yield of what I've gotten out of my bev peppers. So we have some good producers. Emerald Fire and Spicy Slice have been some of the good producers that have bacterial leaf spot resistance. And if you like the flavor of a jalapeno and you don't really want any heat, you can even get heatless jalapenos now. They are called fooled you or tricked you. So there are some different species where you can have those options as well. If you're a pico de gallo person, then you probably want to grow some serrano peppers. These are even smaller than the jalapeno, a little bit thinner walled. And we don't really let them mature all the way to red. They're typically eaten green. So this is a picture of flaming jade that does have bacterial leaf spot resistance. So does hot rod. So some good options there for you with just a little bit more Scoville units. Now we're getting a little bit warmer, right? We're getting into the cayennes, and some of the good producers over the last couple of years have been Giant Ristas, which we see in the back. That's an All-American Selections winner. Ristra Cayenne, which is, here's an immature version, long, thin peppers. One of the recent All-American Selections winners that, if you like smaller cayenne peppers, Red Ember's a little bit smaller fruit, but we're getting significantly higher Scoville units here, usually from about 30,000 to 50,000. So the Porsches of the pepper world, we're getting into some serious heat, and now we're getting into habaneros. So these are that different species that are really grown for, again, some citrusy, some floral types of taste, but definitely a lot hotter, right? Anywhere from about 100,000 to 300,000 Scoville heat units. And so that's Xavery there on the right hand, but there are also some cultivars that don't have heat. So this is an example of Roulette, which is one that you can get the flavor of habanero, but you don't have to put up with that pretty pungent taste. Then we get into just the craziness. I'm more of a sweet pepper person, I'll admit. So I haven't grown a lot of Scorpions or Carolina Reapers, but these are mean little rascals. And like ghost pepper, for instance, the first one to be tested over 1 million Scoville units. And so we're starting to get into, increasingly bred for really hot peppers. Don't expect a huge production out of these peppers. They tend to be a little bit slower, a little bit lower productivity, but I mean, how many pounds of Carolina Reapers do you really need? So that's a quick road trip around the pepper universe. When we, to kind of summarize some of those, definitely grow what you like, try some different peppers, be aware of some of the new cultivars, especially because we have increasing choices as far as disease resistance for some of the biggest things we struggle with, and use those disease resistance to help yourself out a little bit and address some of those challenges in your pepper production. All right, now let's get down to really talking about the garden and think about how we buy, plant, grow, and manage some of our peppers. So when you think about peppers, one of the first decisions for we as gardeners is really deciding whether we want to start transplants or whether we want to buy them. And me, I'm kind of a greenhouse geek. So I always prefer to start my own because it gives me the best opportunity to have a really wide selection of cultivars, to be picky about plant health because bacterial leaf spot, some of those bacterial diseases are easily spread by seed, to get the best of the timing and have my peppers ready whenever I want and have the best quality. However, if you don't have great light environments and warm growing conditions for peppers, it might be better to buy transplants. Under cooler conditions, they germinate poorly, and so peppers are something that can be frustrating for early stage gardeners as far as not getting good success with their germination and transplants. So when it comes to seeds, what would we say? We would say purchase from seed suppliers that test seedlots for bacterial disease. And oftentimes on the websites, you can find You know, we tested seed lots of 10,000 for bacterial leaf spot and those types of things because those bacterial diseases spread really easy during transplant production. When you water and splash happens, those bacterial diseases can spread really easily. So that's why we want to be picky about the quality of our seed when we buy. And if you'd like to grow open pollinated cultivars and save your own seed, I just had a little note in here. We tend to talk about peppers as being self-pollinating, which is true, right? They're like tomatoes. They can be self-pollinating, but they do tend to outcross, cross-pollinate commonly, mostly by insects that visit them, and that can be fairly prevalent in your garden. So if you're going to be saving seed, you definitely want to be having your open pollinated cultivars kind of separated where you don't get a lot of those insects cross-pollinating. If you're just growing hybrids to eat and buy hybrid seed again next year, then not a concern at all. Peppers are kind of picky about their environmental conditions, and so these are actually some hydroponic pictures, but I grew a lot of peppers in a lot of different environments, and no matter whether you're starting them in seed or whether you're starting them in rock wool, being really careful about the temperatures that you provide to those young pepper plants is important. So they like, the high 70s, 80, the low 80s for a good germination rate. And when you get down below 60, 65 degrees, you're really going to drop your germination rate in peppers. And when I have conversations with gardeners about them being frustrated with not, getting a good germination rate, oftentimes temperature is the first thing that I come back to. They can germinate with or without light, so that's not an important issue. Most of the time, we'll cover up our peppers with just a little bit of starting greenhouse mix, just so those seeds don't dry out. They can take anywhere from 5 to 14 days to germinate, and we do want to be picky about our moisture in our germination media as well, because if it's going to take 1 to 2 weeks to germinate our peppers, if we have those absolutely in a saturated, completely wet growing germination mix, then we're really running the risk of having them have some disease issues or, rot those seeds. So we want to certainly keep it moist to push germination, but we don't want it completely saturated and wet. Peppers are one that I'll kind of consider getting some fungicide treated seed because they take a little bit longer to germinate. And if I can protect them just a little bit from, Pythium or Rhizoctonia or some of those damping off issues, I will. They can store under good conditions for 2 to 5 years. When it comes to buying transplants, definitely think about the color. These are some of my own peppers, so I'm not picking on anybody else, but under really warm growing conditions, they do tend to stretch a little bit. So watch that, and you can kind of get an idea of the conditions they've been treated under in the greenhouse. A little bit more compact, a little bit younger plant that hasn't been stretched, or, look for those lower leaves and try to make sure they're not, yellowed, indicating that they may have dried out or had lower nitrogen levels. I tend to find that aphids are pretty big fans of my young pepper plants, and so right around that growing point will be the spot where lots of times you'll see some of those aphids. This picture on the right, you can see both live aphids and parasitized. I put this picture in here because I think it's pretty cool. Over in the picture on the left, those are parasitized aphids. So if they're kind of bloated and kind of tan, they've actually had some parasitic wasps that have laid eggs in them. So we've got some biological control happening to help us out right there in our greenhouse. But that's just be on the watch out for aphids as you're selecting peppers. Here's an example of a young pepper transplant that has bacterial leaf spots. So once again, those seed-borne diseases can really wreak havoc in a transplant house. So we want to be picky about the quality of plants that we bring into our gardens. Can we treat this? Yeah, we can use some of the fixed copper sprays, but we're never going to be able to completely knock it out in our garden. And as it infects those leaves, it's going to continue over the course of the growing season to reduce the yield. It's important to harden off our peppers well, slowly get them acclimated to the temperature, the moisture levels that they'll be introduced to in the garden, higher light levels than they'll experience in a greenhouse. And of course, more wind equals more water loss. So we don't want them to be scorched like this. Will this pepper survive? Yeah, it will. But peppers aren't really fast growers out of the gate. They don't jump back as fast after transplanted as, say, a tomato will. So the nicer we treat them, the sooner we'll get to productivity of our peppers. When it comes to site selection, drainage is absolutely critical. I like to say that there are no rain garden vegetables, right? Drainage is essential for really all of our garden vegetables, but peppers are really probably on the highest end of the poorest performers under even moderately poor drainage. So raised beds can be a great option. These are some peppers, if you look in the background here, that are kind of in a little bit lower lying area. You can see some of that leaf curl. So this is just really mediocre performance due to the fact that they've been stressed by high moisture in their root zones for much of their growth. Rotation is really key to really reduce the levels of some of the soil-borne diseases. As far as site preparation, just a little bit below neutral is typically good. Range of textures can be appropriate for growing peppers, but because they really like good drainage, a sandy loam or a loam soil would typically be good. Soil temperatures are key, right? So if we put a pepper out there and it's 50-degree soil temperature, it is absolutely going to sit there and not do anything. So we want to get up in that 60 to 65-degree soil temperature to really get good early growth out of our pepper transplants. No-till gardens can be great for organic matter and many different things, but we want to keep in mind that those are going to keep our soil temperatures cooler a little bit later in the season, so we might not be able to get our plants in as early. I've just got a little bit of information here about how we would typically fertilize peppers. A really general nitrogen recommendation would be about in that 2 to 2.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And oftentimes we put about half of that on in our typical pre-plant fertilization. Most of our P and our K will be delivered in pre-plant fertilization, but lean on your soil test for this, right? Because that P and K are going to really, completely depend upon what the soil levels are of those nutrients. As you get your peppers going, make sure that you don't transplant them into a parched, dry soil. Water them in, get them a little bit of starter fertilizer so that those young roots right there in that transplant ball are going to have some easy to pick up soluble nutrients early on. Late afternoon, a cloudy day, anything that we can lower that transplant stress, because they have what we call moderate hardiness as a transplant. They're not quite as tough as tomato, and they establish a little bit slower than tomato or cabbage as far as expanding that root mass. I think one of the biggest things for good pepper performance is good mulching. And so mulching well equals garden happiness. And lots of times when I do my trials, just because there's a lot of them, I'll use plastic mulch, which can be great to increase the early season root zone temperature for our peppers. But I typically use a straw mulch in the aisleway, good to reduce compaction and increase soil moisture infiltration and moderate soil temperature. So you have lots of different options as far as stakes and cages. Some of our newer commercial types of peppers are really nice, squatty, short, compact plants. And so, our stakes essential, maybe not 100% essential, but I tend to do some stake and weave. This is just a little bit of the Florida weave, kind of a shorter version of what I do on my tomatoes, because once those plants get some good fruit on them, they tend to lodge or fall over. So I like to support them a little bit. Makes them easier and faster to pick. I don't have any fruit on the ground because it's so sad when you have a beautiful, nearly ripe pepper fruit that sat on the ground and started to get some bottom rot. Cages can also be great. When it comes to watering, this, typical for other garden vegetables, we'll say a minimum of about 1 inch per week. Lots of times we talk about warm season crops as being deeper rooted and more resilient against drought stress. And I'm not saying that that's not true, right, compared to a leafy vegetable or a cool season vegetable. But as a fruiting crop, if we run them through periods of drought stress, then it's gonna stress them, and that stress response will be to drop flowers, right, and not set as much fruit. So consistent moisture keeps our productivity in flower set, fruit set, and bearing potential. So that's some of the many benefits of irrigation, consistent moisture. We'll say that roots can, in peppers, reach a depth of about 3 feet. Of course, some of us, in parts of Tennessee where there's just no rooting soil 3 feet deep, can kind of chuckle at that. But how deep they root does depend on how we treated them early in their life. So peppers typically have a strong taproot. But if we transplant them and we disrupt that taproot, then they'll have a more fibrous root system, which often won't be as deep. And more, some of our newer pepper cultivars are kind of being bred for a little bit higher shoot to root ratio, meaning that they're often grown in commercial production where we have irrigation, where we have fertigation, those types of really keeping them happy, right? And we want them to produce more shoots and more fruit, which just makes it all the more likely that we'll need to treat them well in our gardens to get optimum productivity. A few notes about what peppers really prefer in their growing environment. They do not like night temperatures below 50. That'll be really bad for setting flowers and for pollination. They prefer about 70 to 80 degree day temperatures for growth. And if we get cool, if we get warm, those will be poor pollination and fruit set. You may have experienced this in your own garden in some of our challenging summer conditions, but our smaller fruited cultivars tend to be a little bit more resilient to the extremes in moisture and temperature. If we're gonna have challenges with drop flowers and maybe poor fruit quality, we'll tend to see that in our bell peppers, and our smaller hot stuff might be a little bit more forgiving, so to speak. We do provide, of course, nitrogen at planting, and then oftentimes we'll have a side dressing about after the first flowering, but we want to be careful to not have excessive nitrogen because those peppers will just produce lush, beautiful plants, and we will not be, sending them the message that they need to be creating good progeny, right? This is actually a question that we get a lot from home gardeners. I've got beautiful pepper plants, but I don't have any peppers. And oftentimes we'll relate that back to a kind of excessive nitrogen fertilization. This slide right here is just kind of a smorgasbord. It's a little bit of a few extra notes about fruiting on peppers. They are not really photo period sensitive, so we don't really have long day or short day peppers. Most people say that as long as you have more than 10 hours of light, which we will in all of our warm conditions, they will set fruit. Most of the time, the fruits mature about a month to 50 days after flowering. But of course, if you pick them green, sometimes you can get a little bit shorter than that. I already did mention actually that smaller fruited types can be a little bit more tolerable, kind of variable conditions. The pungent types, right, our zippy fruit tend to set better and yield better at our higher temperatures. We think about, where a lot of our hot peppers are grown in New Mexico and those types of environments. I did actually mention that full coloration all the way to maturity can reduce yield because with those mature fruits still on the plant, it won't set and mature as many new flowers with a higher risk of disease. This actually is just, I want to kind of give a little plug for one of our brand new extension pubs that just came out last week. So this is a cutout of a piece of a table in W804A, which is a new publication on managing fertility in the home garden. So it helps you have a little bit of accessory information about your soil tests, and it also provides some good table on different timing and volumes of side dressing for lots of different types of fruit and vegetables. And so I just picked this out where it has tomato and peppers. And what I wanted to point out here is that we kind of slightly adjusted our notes. We have information here for additional nitrogen during the growing season, but you'll see these ammonium nitrate or these urea types of fertilizer, we're not really saying that we recommend for tomatoes and peppers, our fruiting crops, because when we plug a whole bunch of those ammonium type of fertilizers, it can actually increase the risk for blossom end rot. So calcium nitrate, a nitrate form of fertilizer, or these organic types of fertilizer, which are a little bit more slowly available, are probably better for our fruiting crops as a side dressing. I kind of wanted to give a little bit of a note there. When it comes to harvest and storage, the more mature that pepper fruit is, the better it'll store because it'll have a thicker waxy cuticle. We do want to cut the fruit off of our pepper plants, especially our larger bells that have that thicker stem. And that's because when we pull them off, it's really easy to do stem damage and break fruit, break stems and pull off additional leaves. And we want to leave as many leaves as possible on our plant to carry out photosynthesis and protect those younger peppers from sun scald, which is an issue that I do see a lot in some of my trials. And bell peppers especially can actually be chilling sensitive. And so we don't really want to store them at like 40-degree regular refrigerator temperature for long periods of time, because they can see chilling damage, little pitting. So about 50 to 55 degrees is better as a storage temperature for our bell peppers. The last few minutes of the presentation here, I just wanted to show you some pictures and talk a little bit about some of the disease challenges that we see and some of the physiological challenges that we see sometimes in our peppers. So what are some of the problems that we see? Now, this one I've already talked about, so you kind of already got the gist on bacterial leaf spot, especially in our climates where you have a lot of moisture and we have a lot of warm summer conditions. Bacterial diseases can spread really rapidly. This little note with all the numbers means that under really good spreading conditions, in 1 year, just one seed in 10,000 can spread bacterial leaf spot throughout the greenhouse and then can splash and spread throughout the field. Under good conditions, good, I say that like a pathologist, we can get up to 100% infection. So consider it a very contagious pathogen, which means getting clean seed is really, really important. A rotation, because this can still be present on some older decaying tissue in the field. We don't want overhead watering. And if we have problems with bacterial leaf spot, we want to not use the same stakes and stuff the next year. Here's a close-up shot of bacterial leaf spot on a pepper. You might see this picture again. So this is what it looks like in the field. And really what we see is we're losing leaf material, right? So the more diseased leaves we have, the less productive those leaves are at carrying out photosynthesis and sending sugars to our developing fruit, so it just weakens the entire plant. This is a picture of Phytophthora root rot on peppers. And so what Phytophthora really loves is a fungal-like pathogen. It really loves free water in the soil so that it can move freely and infect. And so any soil that's poorly drained, that's compacted, that's really fine, we think of our clay soils, those are excellent conditions for the spread of Phytophthora. So for us as gardeners, the best thing is drainage, 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 and rotation. There is some resistance, as I mentioned, but it's mostly in your more commercial light green bells. So, so getting good drainage is the best thing we can do to avoid Phytophthora. This is a disease that is more challenging, I think, to avoid, because southern blight, Sclerotium ralsei, affects a whole wide range of plants. And you know what it likes? Warm, humid summer conditions, which means, you know, Tennessee summers. And so oftentimes it can be in some of our planting areas and infects a lot of our ornamental crops. And what you see with southern blight is this white mycelial growth right along the stem line. And then these little brown mustardy looking things those are the resistant structures, kind of the propagules just spread this pathogen, the sclerotia. So how do we deal with it? Well, we can have long rotations. We can use grasses, things like that aren't a host, that aren't infected. We can use solarization. If we see just a few spots, like one plant or something in our garden area, dig it out and take the surrounding soil so that you don't leave any of those little propagules there. But we don't really have any cultivars that have resistance. So this is something that we kind of have to deal with our management. Mm-hmm. Here's one that's not a disease at all, right? It's a physiological problem. Sun scald. Honestly, I probably lose more fruit to sun scald than I do almost anything else, especially, you know, the big productive bell peppers that set a lot of fruit. And sun scald tends to be worse on our larger fruited types of peppers. Mature green fruit are the most sensitive. How do we deal with it? We want to make sure that we keep as much leaf cover on our plant as possible, right? So that gets back to kind of bacterial leaf spot and making sure that we keep our pepper plants healthy and that we don't, rip off extra leaves when we're doing harvests and those types of things. Some other fruit issues that we see on your left, we see kind of those concentric rings, and that is anthracnose. A pretty common issue that we'll see on peppers. It tends to infect at kind of a mature green stage. We can get a little bit of orangey, salmony colored ooze, which is an indicator of anthracnose. Oftentimes we'll see it kind of on the wall of the pepper. And then over here on your right, that is an example of blossom end rot. So similar to tomatoes, peppers, especially our larger fruited types, can get blossom end rot. Now, there might actually be some secondary infection in there. Sometimes we'll get some other sorts of fungus that get in there and start to break down on that tissue. But it was early on the same issue that causes blossom end rot. So what are some of the symptoms? Well, they can be typically on the bottom side, right, where those the blossom end, where those young cells are expanding. The larger peppers are worse. And what it really is not having enough calcium in the fruit as it matures. Can be an early season issue when, the soil temperatures are cooler, when the plant's growing really rapidly. And it's not often so much an issue of not having enough calcium in the soil. It's more an issue of not getting the calcium that's in the soil to the expanding fruit. So how do we deal with it? Well, we want to make sure that we don't provide excessive nitrogen, right? For a couple of reasons. One, because really lush growth that creates a lot of leaf material, those leaves kind of have a competitive advantage against the fruit in terms of attracting water, which carries nitrogen, right? So if we have a big leaf matter that's rapidly transpiring and losing water, then that'll be pulling water with calcium away from the fruit. We don't want to provide excessive calcium or magnesium or ammonium forms of nitrogen because those are, those are cations that can compete with calcium for uptake. So we want to use nitrogen in nitrate forms. Then we want to have steady soil moisture, so we don't have a lot of fluctuations, and we want to protect the roots. So we want to make sure that in our cultivation and things, we don't cause a lot of root damage.